Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first ever virtual Crane Research Forum. My name is Janelle Williamson, and I am the administrative coordinator here at the Crane Center. And we are very excited to have you all here in our audience for our first research forum of the fall, and even more excited to have Dr. Harrison as our teacher today. So before we introduce Dr. Harrison, I'm going to go through some practicals about this recording. So first of all, this is being recorded, and we will send this recording and the speaker slides to you all via email afterwards. Dr. Harrison is going to be speaking for about 40-45 minutes, and then after that, we will have time for audience question and answer. So for question and answer time, please use the Q&A feature. And in that feature, you are able to submit questions and also see the questions that the other audience members are submitting. And you'll be able to upvote questions that you want to hear the answer to, so that when we're in Q&A, the most popular questions are being answered first. If you have a comment rather than a question, please use the chat box feature. We'll be monitoring that and having conversation on there. And you can choose to send either just to Dr. Harrison your comments, or you can choose to send it to the entire audience as well. So make sure you choose where it's being sent. Also, at the end of the webinar, you will be redirected to a very, very short survey that informs future Crane events. So please, when you leave the meeting, take a minute or less to fill that out for us. And now I am pleased to introduce our speaker of the day, Dr. Dorian Harrison. So Dr. Harrison is an assistant professor of teaching and learning at the OSU Newark campus. As a literacy researcher, her research interests focus on equity issues in literacy education, paying particular attention to how race, class, and language affect teaching and learning. So drawing on her personal experiences as a K-6 educator, she seeks to encourage critical approaches to literacy in the classroom. Her other interests include the role of diverse literature in supporting multilingual learners. She also supports pre-service teachers as they develop their understanding and skills related to literacy instruction for a global world. Dr. Harrison teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in reading and language arts methods and graduate courses related to literacy. And so today, Dr. Harrison is here to present her research on what can we learn from after-school programs about literature, ELA instruction, and relationships. So let's welcome Dr. Harrison.
Thank you. All right, let me go ahead and see if I can get my screen share started. I do not have permission to share. There we go. Thank you, Janelle. Let's go ahead here. Excuse me as technology seems to do what it does in 2020. There we go. All right. So again, thank you for that lovely introduction and for inviting me to come and speak and share aspects of my research and my passion for equity and literacy education. I want to start with a little bit about myself in terms of who I am outside of academia, or who I was outside of academia as well. I come with about 13 years of teaching experience in K-6, pre-K settings, but also within the after-school world. And so this was something that I wasn't expecting to come back up in my research, being in an after-school setting and developing such a passion for after-school learning. And so this is a picture of myself before the dreadlocks with my first group of kids that I developed an after-school program with in connection with one of my sorority sisters. And so not only was I teaching, but also directing and leading children through after-school efforts. So that's really my approach and my thinking when I'm coming into the space of after school programs and after school learning. So again, the title of my talk is What Can We Learn from After School Programs about literature, ELA instruction, and relationships. And I want to use today not only as an opportunity for me to share what I learned and how I came to understand a culture of learners, but also as a time to engage with you all about what does it really mean to learn within after school context. So know that I engage in ethnographic research and case studies, which means I am not going to provide you with a lot of statistics or analyses of data, but instead, in the same way teachers seek to understand academic history to better serve our students, I approach the same process through a lens of cultural understanding. So you'll see that in the ways that I present my data through a story-like manner. So let's begin with what after schooling looks like. And so in particular, I focus on after school programs such as you would find in the YMCA, Boys and Girls Club, the after school sort of environment where you'll have staff members, the kids are playing, there's homework time, etc. I'm not looking at like the sports and those types of activities. And so within this idea of what after schooling is for me, there are also stereotypes associated with this concept of after school about organized chaos, kids running everywhere. And if you've ever peeked in, sometimes it does look like that. There's a knowledge that there's a lack of funding. There's a high turnover rate in terms of staff, and sometimes a lack of parent participation and input. So if you really think about it, it almost sounds like a school, right? But there's another aspect or layer to that community. That's funding and who is being served. So let's start with who's being served. In 2014, we find that an estimated about 10 million children were participating in after-school programs nationwide. And if we're taking a closer look at the demographics and disaggregating that data a little bit more, we find that African-American children and Latinx children are twice as likely to be found participating in these programs as compared to their white counterparts. In addition, there's a large number of children still waiting on services to be made available for them. So in the context of where I was situated for my study, it was in Illinois, where we found that for every one child that was in a program, there were still 2 waiting to get in. In addition, I took a peek at Ohio just to see what that was looking like. And here in Ohio, we see a similar pattern with for every one child that's in a program, here 3 are still waiting to get in, and still finding the same African-American and Latinx children having higher levels of participation in these programs. Another aspect of this data is the fact that low-income areas have a lack of quality programs available. In addition, there are higher numbers of people waiting to get into these programs in low-income areas as well. Now let's talk about the funding. Well, in 2017, we know we heard a lot about the funding and 21st Century Community Learning Center grants. And I want to sort of take you on a small historical journey about where these grants were developed and how they are impacting after-school programs today. So this grant program was passed in 1994 as part of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And it was originally designed to be housed in schools, Title I schools in particular. And for all the children who came to participate, their family members, et cetera, could also come in and participate in the learning programs as well. So there was a focus on academic programs and outcomes. Now in 2002, under No Child Left Behind, states began to assume responsibility of disseminating the funds to the appropriate programs. So these programs didn't have to be located necessarily within a school, but instead it was a focus on the populations that were being served. So again, looking specifically or thinking about the African-American, Latinx families and children who would be assumed to be getting or having access to these types of centers. So 3 goals are associated with these 21st century grants, one being academic achievement, and then supplementing academic programs that you would normally see in schools and providing additional education services to families. And so what this means is that these after-school programs are receiving these grants under the premise that they're going to design activities that promote these 3 core goals. Around the same time we're seeing an emphasis on these 21st century grants, we also see an increase in the number of studies that are featuring after-school programs housed within low-income areas that are filled with children from African American and Latinx backgrounds. And we see here in Posner and Vendel's work, they discuss the positive effects of the participation in these programs. They also point to how low-income African American children performed higher in school when they participated in this program when compared to their counterparts. However, they also describe and paint a picture of the community through a deficit lens in terms of urban neighborhoods. And additionally, it was a strong focus on academic outcomes versus what the community had to offer. And another look at some data and explanations of how after school or out of school learning is understood. We see here an NCES study or survey, excuse me, on parents' education-related activities that they're doing with their children outside of school. And they disaggregated the data here based on the parents' level of education achievement. And so for me, I wanted to look at a few of these areas in particular, like the school-like practices is what I'm referring to them, like them visiting a library with their children. We see that here, what we assume to be low income families, because there's less academic achievement, did a lot less with visiting libraries type activities with their kids. In addition, told child a story, right? We see here still, maybe not to as high a degree, but there's still less activity happening with the parents who have less than a high school degree or below a bachelor's degree. But of importance to me, being from an African-American family, was this discussion of family history and ethnic heritage. As for me, you see that is a form of narrative, right? It's a form of performed storytelling that in my mind should have been included in Told Child a Story. And so we see here that there's a lot more emphasis on that in these families or with these parents who have less than a high school degree or below a bachelor's degree. And so I began noticing a pattern, right, on how data was being presented in relationship to these after-school programs that cater to low-income Black and Brown children. And lo and behold, a recent study just came out that found a similar pattern as well. When you're thinking about after-schooling in urban spaces, there is a focus on academic outcomes and the risks associated with living in those spaces as a youth. They question whether it's worth the investment and if there are academic benefits to be had. In addition, within my own research and studies of after-schooling, there's disparities in quality is something that was a lingering theme throughout. Now, on the other hand, we see that suburban and affluent spaces, when they're describing these after-school programs, focus on the effects of, well, maybe I'm just in too many after-school programs. So they cast a wider and a broader net. And they talk about youth having this burnout effect. They talk about improving student portfolios in preparation to go to the best schools. And they look at the generalized social benefits that children gain or families might gain from being a part of these programs as well. Then again, within my own work and my own understandings, it's maintaining these high quality standards becomes a driving force for these programs as well. So of those core elements, I really wanted to find out how I could re-envision after schooling and how it had been done already within the research. And so I landed on Woodland's article. It's a 2008 article, and he's actually done another more recent one in 2016 that highlights after-school programs, specifically looking at tutoring and what makes them effective with African-American children. And in this particular study, African-American males, right? And he found these core elements of effective programs for Black youth, highlighting the relationships, flexibility, the way staff are trained, space, cultural components, family involvement, enriching curricula, and more. And above all of this, right, he's being guided by this theory of cultural relevancy by Ladson Billings, 1995, seminal work. We hear about it and see it in education often. And undergirding this theoretical foundation of cultural relevancy work is an understanding of student success, cultural competency, and critical consciousness, like those three elements, right? And Woodland, highlighting in his study, focused on critical consciousness the most. The other two were there, but he talks a lot about this idea of critical consciousness when working with groups of African-American males in the after-school program. And this is a key aspect because critical consciousness helps aid young Black youth in understanding the complex interactions and relationships between education, the system of education, the system of racism, and the system of inequity that they might experience or they have experienced through their schooling. And it is this awareness that helps create sound programs that it can empower youth to see themselves in ways that they may not have previously. So this study posed key questions and ideas concerning academic activities, such as how we're designing tutor programs, that one-on-one tutoring just might not be enough in and of itself to help Black youth, and an emphasis on mentorship through dialogue and activity that addresses the disconnect that Black youth can experience within the education system. I also turned to additional studies of out-of-school worlds by looking at Hull and Schultz seminal pieces. This 2002 work, I love this book. It's inspired a lot of how I see and understand literacy in this particular study. And so in Hull and Schultz, they look at the context of the after-school program and taking critical looks at the roles and constraints around what we consider to be literacy. And they claim that much of what we know today concerning literacy was and still is formed through studies conducted outside of school, right? So take a moment to really think about that. A lot of what we're doing in terms of literacy strategies, ideas, were first theorized, hypothesized in these out of school contexts, right? And so in addition to that understanding, they talk about how literacy involves all these elements, right? Ideologies, discourses, identities. But in addition, they pinpoint or they point out that Black and Brown students are socialized differently than what we may expect or assume within the institution of education. And so within these out-of-school worlds, we get to understand these social differences or these unique aspects to these kids in a way that may not be happening inside of our schools. So to better illustrate this, we find a description of Street's work inside of their studies, as well as G and others, that talk about documenting literacy in everyday lives of the child and or a community. And the collective works emphasize the ways everyday literacy is associated with particular cultures. So there's an emphasis on the way local communities determine and are determined by the literacy practices across time and space. And so here we see, if we're thinking about a child in our classroom, our after school program, not only are they learning in their home and bringing in practices and understandings there, but also from within their community, from within their schooling, and as well from the media. And another look at impacts on Black and Brown children in after-school spaces, I turn to the fifth dimension, a study published by Cole and the Distributed Literacy Consortium back in 2006. And within this work, they look at the uniqueness of after-school life and how a focus on play, building on Vygotsky's work and relationships and learning, can impact how children interact and understand within the after-school programs. And so there's an awareness of practices and sentiments that dominate educational policies and practices. So they're building this critical consciousness within the way they're developing their program, but also in the way that they were enacting their program by how they were training their tutors. So in addition, it highlights the way the youth and their college mentors engaged in these hybrid practices and literacy practices through listening and learning. So community-oriented approaches, right, in the after-school realm still have to be culturally relevant. And that's not often a discussion that we hear and see. So all of this information shaped, and it really did shape how I positioned myself when I entered my study, during my data collection, before my data collection, and well after. Now, I want to take time to introduce you to the site of my study. Now recall, this is ethnographic work, so I'm going to take some time to really read the descriptions that I developed based off of all my data that I gathered. So if my head goes down a little bit, it's just because I'm trying to be cognizant that I want to tell the story in a way that is as authentic as possible. Curb Center is located at the corner, just north of campus, down the street from the hospital, and 1 block from the police station. It's in an old church building that transformed into an after-school learning community. You will find it nestled within a predominantly African-American neighborhood where generations of family enjoyed what the building and the people who work in it have to offer. At almost 50 years old at the time, this after-school program was a part of the local community and had made itself known with the local colleges, businesses, and more. What also made the center unique were the people it served. The center catered to predominantly African-American youth, which is in line with the research we just talked about. Locals were said to refer to the after-school program as the Black program, due in large part to the population it served, rich in history and tradition within the community. No one really seemed bothered by these statements. In fact, they enjoyed catching up with their friends and neighbors in a safe place outside of school. Truth be known, we hear a lot of police sirens moving through the streets, and on occasion, we'd hear of situations with families and students that were less than appealing. However, this space was still a mecca. It was a mecca of Black intelligence and growth. There were children walking over a mile to come and fellowship through sports and games on the weekend, youth actively giving of their time to participate in fundraisers to help fund the different activities. There were notable sports figures from within the community and more that could be found visiting and sharing their stories with the youth. This space was special. It brought forth the truth that the children and this part of the community had a knowledge and had a style of learning that needed to be told. Well, fast forward multiple months into my data collection. It was January 2017 and I was well into my data. I had my focus and I was there. I was in the games room with the staff, interns, and more on this day. Students from the local university who were new interns had come in to learn more about the programs and participate in the weekly meeting. People were chatting amongst themselves as the director and chief operating officer stood to start the meeting. After some brief introductions, the COO stood to discuss programming, implementation of programs, activities, and outcomes. Then he said something that still stands out for me today. We are not a school. Now, it may not seem like much, but for me, it was a profound statement to be made. Within my observations up to that day, using a very teacher-like lens, I had made so many connections between what was happening out of school to what I had known to be true in school. So no, he was telling us, this is not a school. This will not be a school, and it has not been a school. This statement continued to echo in the back of my mind, and it would not be silenced. These are those moments in education, in research, in qualitative research, where we have to listen, reflect, and sometimes find a new point of focus. Yes, I said that, a new point of focus at this stage in my data collection. So that's what I did. I listened, I reflected, and I changed my focus. So my focus then involved looking specifically at literacy events and literacy practices a little more deeply than I had been previously, and to stop really using that teacher lens that I was coming into this study with. And so I looked to the work of Barton and Hamilton and their descriptions of what literacy practices and literacy events are. I'm going to offer you this example of what I mean. So with literacy events, I'm thinking about, say, morning meeting. You have all your children sitting on the carpet. You're going over the days of the week, the weather, whatever you might be doing in that meeting. So that's your literacy event. It's observable. It's part of an activity that's situated around a literacy activity, right? The dialogue, the reading. Versus literacy practices being what people do with literacy, the cultural ways of engaging within that event. And so I'm looking at how I had my students do different, let's say, the chants, or it might be the way that my students are supposed to respond to me in a certain way, or the way I'm displaying, right, let's say your morning meeting chart or whatever. Or it could also be how I position myself above the children while they sit below as a practice of being a teacher and students in that literacy event. So in thinking about the relationship between literacy events and practices, I developed a more focused approach to examining literacy in the context of the after-school space. So I was thinking about moments of shared reading because I had seen this happening across the Curb Center, and I wanted to learn more and dig deeper. Moments of shared reading during the tutor program mirrored a lot of what I was seeing in school-based learning practices. So this is what I wanted to focus on, a tutor program. So I want to reemphasize again that there were other literacy practices related to reading happening. So I did filter down to the tutor program. So the tutor program was designed to identify youth who were in the after-school setting who are 1 to 2 years behind in reading. There was a literacy specialist hired who developed a plan of study for each of the recruited students. The tutors were then recruited and trained on the curriculum, and then were paired with their tutee for a period of 3 months or more. The shared reading lesson had the following practices associated with it. They modeled reading, adaptations to the reading environment. They were told to sit side by side versus in front of one another. Access to pre-selected text based on their reading level, And then depending on where they were, some of the children did the segmenting of words to help them with their phonics development or their reading multisyllabic words, right? Some of them were sight words. Go fish games with those sight words. Choral reading was also being modeled and scaffolded. And there was always a focus on a comprehension strategy that was supposed to be modeled by the tutor and then practiced alongside the tutee. And throughout this model, you saw an emphasis on positive reinforcements. So who were the tutors? Well, it was a mixed group of different types of students or retired teachers. But an interesting fact is that it was still matching what we normally see in the field of education. The tutors were predominantly white, and then as well predominantly female. On the youth side during this time, the tutees or the youth were between 2nd and 7th grade. All were African American. There were 16 males and 9 females. And this was across 2 towns and from multiple schools. So I captured within this tutor program multiple cases within my data collection. But for this presentation, I want to focus on one case in particular, Sam. Sam was in second grade at the time of this study. He was identified as a reluctant reader, not an excellent student, but he put forth strong efforts in his work. And these are his descriptions. He loved sports, he was silly, he was fast, he loved to race, and he was very strong-willed. So in the next set of narrative descriptions, I offer you data that I collected on Sam and his interactions with his tutor. So I call these interactions fort reading, and it'll become clear why it's titled that way in just a moment. So this is fort reading episode 1. I walked into the library and into a room filled with the sounds of tutors and tutees talking and reading books. There were tables placed into a U shape and a pair of readers at each table. The dividers used on the tables created a fractured environment in which they were working. Everyone had their own bubble. Students worked alongside their tutors to read and then complete a game or activity based on the literacy skill being practiced. However, there was much more happening before those skills were being practiced as well. As I'm looking around, I noticed that there was a pair sitting on the floor next to a bookshelf. Several dividers surrounded the young man and his tutor in this makeshift fort that was taking place. Normally a very reluctant reader, Sam and his tutor had developed a world in which they could escape. Within this particular event, the normal literacy practices were not being followed. The tutor sat with his back to the books. Sam reached for a book from the shelf and opened it. Definitely not his assigned book. He browsed through the pages a minute, sat the book down, and began to read silently. His tutor asked if he could read aloud. He could read aloud. Sam looked up, not too pleased with the request, but began to speak the words on the page. He did. He read and stopped occasionally and asked for help. The tutor didn't offer up front when Sam got to a hard part, but just patiently waited. About halfway through the book, Sam had had enough. He asked his tutor to continue reading, more or less demanded, and they continued down this path. No real questions being asked, but instead an enjoyment of simply reading. At the end, Sam's tutor asked him his general opinion of the text, congratulated him on reading the book, and finished the lesson for the day. So what we find in this first episode are just some quick observations of personal literacy practices that Sam was bringing to this event. And the fact that he didn't want to sit in the prescribed side-by-side manner, but instead wanted to bring in personal ways of how engaging with books that he did at home. And this is what he had described to me in later conversations. Right? And so, no, they didn't sit side by side. No, they didn't use the leveled book that was selected for him. When talking to his tutor afterwards, I was shocked to hear why they had moved into the fort. I expected him just to say that, hey, Sam wanted to, but instead he said, well, sitting side by side just doesn't work for my kid, right? So there was this awareness that his child, his tutee, did not necessarily meet or function well within the environment as it was designed. So we see this sort of modeling of what to do, right? Or how to approach children in a way that's more authentic and where you're listening. In addition, I asked the tutor why he didn't engage in the various types of questions involved with the skills that were supposed to be practiced. And the tutor said, well, that's not how I engage with books. And so it was shocking to me that I had never thought about this before. The pure enjoyment of just enjoying a book leading the experience. And so for the tutor, he was bringing in his own ways and practices of engaging with text into the environment as well. So now we turn to Fort Reading episode 2. I want to offer you another description of Sam and his tutor. On this day, it was obvious that Sam was annoyed with the process. Today, they were seated in the back of the room at their assigned table. His tutor pulled out the pre-selected book and asked if Sam was ready to begin. Sam sat with his head down on the table, unwilling to lift it. His tutor proceeds to read the book, modeling fluent reading and stopping at the sight words highlighted within the text. Sam sits with his head down throughout. As his tutor nears the middle of the book, Sam begins to breathe harder and harder. Eventually, the tutor and I lock eyes and notice that, yes, Sam is asleep. You know that good sleep you get when someone's reading to you and the drool kind of comes and hits the table? That was the situation. For all intents and purposes, the tutor followed the lesson plans and the model behaviors he was trained to do. However, something was missing within this event. This time it was different. There was a disengagement. And so in the second episode, we see that, again, there's an emphasis on that lesson plan or those school-like practices. There was sort of this oversight as to what was really going on with the student, as well as evaluating procedure versus process model, right? And so he was just following the procedures and not really thinking about the process of engaging the child. Right? In my last episode, I want to talk about this. It was a funny yet informative interaction. So by now the pair was used to me staring at them and making notes about their interactions. This particular observation, I noticed something new with the shared reading process. There was some sustained negotiation happening. The tutor and his students sat in their normal spot, tucked away in the back with their fort properly built for reading. Sam was already prepared with a book he had selected from the school library. It was excited to share it with his tutor. Even though the book has been banned from a number of districts around the country, he brought it in anyway. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Captain Underpants, the graphic novel of the century. He proudly touts his book, shaking it back and forth, and opens it quickly to begin reading. Today, Sam has assumed the role of the tutor, and the tutor is actively listening and participating. Sam proceeds to read the book, stopping occasionally to ask the tutor if he understands what's happening. He's modeling the skills needed. The text, Captain Underpants, is above his reading level, so he does have to pause frequently to ask for help. However, he is still in the lead. So let's think about the tutor's approach to these 3 episodes, right? What I found was some similarities in what I had read in Cole's 5th dimension work, in another study that was part of that consortium, La Clase Mágica by Vasquez, and in their descriptions of after-school programs in a tutor-like setting, there's an emphasis on relationship and play. the relationship that the tutors are building with the youth, and the playfulness that should be involved with the activities. And so our tutor in these 3 episodes is showing relationship and play with the blending the blending of school and after school practices, cultural competence that he's bringing, the critical consciousness that he's also bringing, and his emphasizing student success. Another way to look at this, and I want to come back to the illustration. You'll notice that these are solid lines now. It was just because it was a little too busy, and you'll see here in a second. We want to then focus on how I could graph or see these literacy practices and events that were occurring using the same model. And we see here that the environment, right, that was being created by the tutor program was, yes, leading the event. However, Sam brought in his own understandings of how to engage with text and how to essentially change the environment to being a fort, a place of comfort, just like he had in his own home. In addition, book selection. For Sam, he really liked to have the choice of books. That's what motivated him to read. And so, again, not doing necessarily what the Curb Center or the tutor program had promised with the shape of the activity, but instead he allowed himself to have that agency and the power to choose his own books to guide his own learning. In terms of the tutor, looking at the procedure approach that was being negotiated throughout, as well as his understanding of the adult-child relationship, emphasizing wanting to know Sam more and getting to experience, a different way to engage with text. Sort of this imitation, right? In that middle section, they're learning, they're seeing other practices, but there's also an imitation. And you see this especially when Sam becomes the leader, right? In that last episode where he is leading the literacy event, he is guiding his tutor through shared reading. And these points of sort of imitation, right, is this what G calls this way that newcomers pick up tacit knowledge through participation within the community. So as much as Sam was learning about reading and about his tutor was also learning about Sam, his community, his culture, and experiences with text. So what are the implications of this work? I know what I've learned as a researcher, but also I bring in my lens again as a teacher and as an educator. And what I find is that relationships and instruction, we should always invite those home literacy practices. And I know this is nothing brand new, but it's just being re-emphasized within this work, that we want to give students the opportunity to bring in these home literacy practices so they know their cultures and their experiences are also a part of the learning process, whether it's out of school or in school. Our choices and strategies and approaches, we must understand as well, are biased. I know that a lot of the choices and ways I engage with children in my classroom, now that I reflect on it, could have been better. I did a lot of things because those were my experiences. That's how I felt it would be best for my students. But instead, taking a step back and looking for these points of negotiation that we can have with children during these learning events. And having this seek first to understand mentality, sort of exhibited by the tutor in this instance, and as well as the understanding that the curriculum provides an outline. It's up to the individual teachers, educators, tutors to make that outline work for the community of students that they are engaging with. Then we're looking at relationships in terms of literature. Reading levels have a purpose, they do, but as we saw in these examples, Sam never really wanted to engage with the texts that were at his level. In fact, he called them baby books. Um, and so he continued to read texts that were harder for him, but made the same amount of growth that the other children did at the end of the program. So really thinking about what is the purpose of the reading levels as it is connected to the activity. Also thinking about the motivation, right? So if they're allowed to have more choice, then they might be motivated more to read. And a cultural awareness recognition. All right. That ends my presentation, and I am looking forward to hearing from you all.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So yeah, if there are any questions, again, feel free to put those in the Q&A. While we wait on those, I had a question or two, so we'll see how much we get through. So yeah, I really noticed that you emphasize this importance of learning being culturally relevant. So I was curious, in your experience as, you know, a professor teaching pre-service teachers, how do you emphasize that with, you know, soon to be teachers? What are your strategies in making sure they're prepared for that?
Oh, that's an awesome question. For me, I like to do this immersion, right? First and foremost, colleges of education are not filled with people who necessarily look like me, right? And so for me, that's part of the experience, is the fact that I've entered this space, and the way I interpret and understand research and theory is through a different cultural lens than maybe those students are used to hearing and seeing. And so that's one of the first ways that I'm bringing that into training of teachers. But in addition, we have these hard conversations. I don't necessarily shy away from them. We have to be really aware of our experiences in the past and moving forward. And especially where I'm situated now in more or less rural Ohio, that push towards that global understanding is part of building the, I would say, part of helping teachers understand that there's a critical consciousness that's needed, even if you're in a location that's primarily, you know, homogenous. This work is not just for Black and brown youth, it's for everyone. And so with starting with that foundation and not understanding that it's about building global awareness as well. These teachers are able to then start to go through the process of, okay, well, if I'm trying to think globally, there's all kinds of people globally. I need to understand more cultures. I need to understand more experiences. How can I get those, right? And it could be through literature. It could be through field experiences, or it could be engaging with a professor or a teacher or peer that doesn't quite look like you.
That's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think that's a heavy topic right now in our college of how do we, prep teachers for the reality of the environments in our world in America. So we have a question from Matt Brock. It says, great talk. You emphasize the idea of child choice in literature and how Sam's engagement was so much better when he brought his own choice book to the tutor session. What do you recommend tutors or teachers do when a child is not engaged in adult selected literature and does not already have an alternative Captain Underpants in mind?
Well, go find a copy of Captain Underpants. No, that's a great question, Matt. And in all actuality, this is actually something I practiced. So at the end of my dissertation work, I actually went back to the classroom because I felt sort of disconnected. And so when I went into a predominantly Latinx school, I was working with fourth graders, and some third graders came to me as well. And I gave them free choice. I asked their parents, I asked them, what do you want to read? It could have been the newspaper. I had children bring in their home Bibles. I didn't care, right? And so even when we had our, what I call literature meetings, we would sit down and just talk about what they had been reading for that week. They would bring their books and they would ask me questions. So I ended up talking about the Bible some days. I ended up talking about the comics in the newspaper. It ran the gamut, right? And so what I say is just be open to having these conversations with children, surveying your kids to see what their interests are, being an active observer, right? And so you'll pick up as a teacher or as a tutor what they're into if you're just kind of like listen to their conversations and allow them to bring in what they love, right? And I think that's a big part of it. Now, I know that may not work for everyone. I have an unconventional approach to teaching, more or less, but having them just bring in whatever gets them motivated, gets them started, so that maybe down the road they'll be a little more open to those suggestions. Another point I want to talk about is what I said at the end about reading levels and appropriateness of the event. So shared reading, it's my own personal belief, doesn't have to be around leveled texts that are for the children. I think there's an appropriate time to do those scaffolds, and then there's times where it could do more harm. And so keep that in mind as well. And Captain Underpants.
Always Captain Underpants. We have another question from Rebecca Dorr. It says, thanks for the great talk. Your point about Sam's agency and choosing his own books is really interesting to me. I wonder if you could speak to the diversity of the characters in the books that were provided and whether characters represented the racial background of the children in the program. How do you think this might play into reading motivation?
Awesome. Great question again. In this particular case, at the program at Curb Center, a lot of the books that they had received were donations from retired teachers, et cetera, families who just wanted to get rid of their books. And in all actuality, there's a pretty diverse mix, right? And then with the grant money they had received to put the program together, they were able to purchase a lot of books. So there was a good variety of representation in the text, because the literacy specialist who was putting this together was cognizant of that research and the cultural understanding that was needed. And for Sam in particular, sorry, I have to remember not to say his real name. For Sam in particular, he just didn't. He wanted comics. He, I later found out, was an avid Fortnite reader, right? And he had his style. And so, whereas I don't want to say it didn't matter, right? And it didn't play a role, it wasn't observed in what I was doing at that time, that he was having that sort of disconnect, right, with the text in terms of his motivation.
Great, thank you. Last call for questions. We can give it a few seconds, see if anything else pops up. Oh, we get one. From Chad Nunemaker. Dr. Harrison, thank you for presenting today. What is the prevailing theory for the reason why there is such a significant difference in engagement in after-school programs based on race and ethnicity?
Okay, sorry, I had to read that one again. I was like, hey. I would say, based on the literature as well as those observations, culturally relevant pedagogical approaches is going to be like at the top there, is that prevailing theory. In the more recent work that does not come into these studies with a deficit lens, I kind of like push those to the wayside. But I wanted to look at these descriptions of what worked, what went right, where they honored the community as well in their descriptions. And so from those culturally relevant pedagogical approaches were on the forefront. Those were the ways of understanding in teaching and learning that could produce the greatest effects and impacts for those children of Black and Brown backgrounds. Beyond that, I would say Vygotsky's work in play and relationship is also going to be one of those that you'll see repeated, especially if you're looking at Cole's work, and La Clase Mágica, as well as Vasquez, I could list a whole lot, I'm sorry, Baquedano Lopez, etc. That's what you're going to see there is that understanding that, yes, you're going to do the scaffolds. They still talk about zone of proximal development, but also that emphasis on relationship and play as being just as important a part of the learning.
Great. All right, we have another one from Carrie Thomas. As an adult who loves children's literature and picture books, which are obviously below my age level, I always want to read these books with students regardless of their age or reading level. Do you think it is okay sometimes to encourage students to give books that they think are, quote, baby books a try?
Yes. And I think it's how you present it. I think that if you come into it as someone you enjoy the book just as much as you hope they do, it sets a purpose and a tone for that engagement with the book that is going to be like, it's going to draw them in, right? It's going to sort of engage them to want to dig a little deeper. In addition, because picture books are so complex, I know we sort of read through them, we'll do our comprehension strategy and sort of move forward. There's so much more you can unpack out of a picture book in terms of the artistry and the way they're designed, and having children try to replicate and extend their understanding of writing, right, associated with picture books as well. So yes, please, 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 please use picture books throughout. And I am an avid reader of picture books as well. I have a lovely collection.
That's awesome. I make my nephew read all my favorite books. Even though I'm not.
My excuse now is, I think my excuse now is, oh, I'm buying books for my child, but no, I'm not.
Yeah, it's for you. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Just remember again, when you press leave meeting, to fill out our quick survey. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Harrison, for your presentation.
Thank you as well. And to all of you who are listening, thank you so much.